Building on Augustine's doctrine of sin, Reinhold Niebuhr, whose years are from 1892 to 1971, explicated the constitutional anxiety resulting from the tension between human freedom and mutability, or finiteness. To put it another way, human beings are ontologically involved in a contradiction. Endowed with intellect and the capacity for moral virtue, humankind cite these as evidence of the possibility for our transcendence of the natural order. Yet standing within nature, we must secure ourselves against the exigencies of nature with limited means. Since we are aware of the perils, responsibilities, and unlimited avenues of action which securing our necessities entails, human natural contingency inevitably evokes a basic insecurity, constitutional anxiety, which to Niebuhr is the internal precondition of sin. Niebuhr denied that sin is the necessary consequence of constitutional anxiety. As biblical faith attests, the providence of God should ideally evoke a response of faith and trust in God. For Niebuhr, this was the heart of biblical revelation, that God reveals God's love and care for human beings through and despite the vicissitudes of the natural order. However, this is not testimony to a special providence for those who are respectfully contingent. Rather, it is a picture of the relationship which should exist between human beings as creatures among other creatures and our Creator. Moreover, as anxiety is the inevitable concomitant of creatureliness, it is likewise the wellspring of creativity. Thus, anxiety can engender either faith and creativity, or pride and rebellion against creatureliness, which is sin. Having diabolical antecedents, sin posits itself in human experience. Niebuhr uses this phrase, sin posits itself, as a way of remaining true to the Augustinian theory of sin and redemption that, contrary to the way the doctrine is often framed and presented as evidence of Augustine's boorishness as a theologian, begins not with original sin, but with original righteousness, original goodness, original virtue. Of the visible creatures, humankind are singularly capable of choosing a response of sin or creativity because of our natural freedom and capacity for self-transcendence. Human nature itself, then, is the occasion, though not the sufficient cause of sin. Niebuhr understood the concept of sin in much the same way that Augustine did, essentially as idolatry. It was not to him, as it was not to Augustine, simply the paradox of insecurity vis-a-vis nature in which humanity stands that generates sin, for that would render the Creator the author of sin. Rather, it was humankind's conscious proclivity to overstate our own significance or that of something other in the overcoming of our insecurity. Quote, "The basic source of temptation resides in the inclination of man either to deny the contingent character of his existence in pride and self-love, or to escape from his freedom in sensuality." Thus, Niebuhr generated two types of sin as pride and sin as sensuality. I will now elucidate the concept of sin as pride in the thought of Niebuhr. When human beings attempt to overreach the limits of our creatureliness or to hide our finiteness, we yield to the sin of pride. Niebuhr held to Pauline and Augustinian conceptions of pride, putatively illuminated in the doctrine of original sin, which I have renamed the doctrine of original righteousness, the doctrine of original virtue. Like Augustine, Niebuhr characterized pride as undue regard for mutable good and named it self-love. Augustine's exposition of the Edenic myth seemed to Niebuhr to assess realistically the fallen state of humankind and advise the extent of our present estrangement from God. Like Augustine, Niebuhr construed the doctrine as an apt metaphor for, though not an all-sufficient etiology of sin. This is important to note because it distinguishes both their biblically derived observations from those of fundamentalist biblical interpreters. It is easy to think of Augustine as a literalist when you forget that he was a rhetorician and that the prevailing method of interpretation in his time was the allegorical method, which reads the stories in ancient texts as allegories speaking to the general condition of humankind. That the story of Adam and Eve provides a realistic assessment of human estrangement also separates Augustine's and Niebuhr's views from the optimistic assessments of human nature and human destiny seen in the Pelagianism of Augustine's day and in the liberalism to which Niebuhr was reacting in light of the world wars and even in light of the racial dynamics in the American context. Moreover, the doctrine reflected what was to Niebuhr the Christian assessment of the centrality of the problem of sin and its remediation in the events concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who embodied the norm of self-sacrificing, agapeic love in his life and atoning death. Niebuhr's rejection of liberalism's confidence, but not of its critical methods. His own confidence in the Bible as an adequate mirror of human actions, and his insistence on the applicability of the doctrine of original virtue that houses the doctrine of original sin for an adequate theological anthropology earned for him the somewhat imprecise appellation neo-Orthodox theologian. Niebuhr articulated three types of sin as pride, seen in individual acts and the collective actions of subsequent generations: pride of power, pride of knowledge, and pride of virtue. He also identified a fourth type of pride originating in the pride of virtue, the pride of self-righteousness. Pride of power manifests in two ways in human beings. In the first of its forms, quote, the human ego assumes its self-sufficiency and self-mastery and imagines itself secure against all vicissitudes, end quote. In order to mitigate our constitutional anxiety, humankind, rather than refer ourselves to God, overestimate our own capacities, exposing ourselves in the era of idolatry. Niebuhr asserted that this particular form of the pride of power is prominent among those, quote, individuals and classes who have a more than ordinary degree of social power, end quote, who do not acknowledge their dimly apprehended weakness, finiteness, and dependence on God because of their self-prepossession. Yet he claimed something even more basic. Life itself is at stake for these people, more so than what he called the secondary securities of power and glory. Driven by fear, these established individuals and social groups seek greater security than they ostensibly already have by hiding from themselves their contingency upon God. Niebuhr, like Augustine, used Paul's thought to illustrate the gravity of their efforts. And he cites Romans. So they, the human creatures, are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Thus, those who are less secure attempt to hide their lack of security, which is both natural and conditioned by socioeconomic and political arrangements, from others. Arrogating a greater degree of power to themselves, inevitably at the expense of other life, they express the will to power through greed, which is evinced more obviously among what he called advancing, as opposed to established, individuals and social groups. He described the second form of the pride of power as, quote, the besetting sin of a bourgeois culture. Because under capitalism, security is sought primarily through economic means and necessarily to the detriment of others. And this is what he said, quote, this is the temptation of a great wealthy nation, the temptation of inordinance in the worship of things. The real problem is not how much or how little we possess, but the number of things or advantages and security for our family that we have over against what our brother has. Niebuhr rejected a too simple Marxian interpretation in ascribing the motive of greed to advancing social groups, positing the theological rationale that for these people, who are equally subject to the vicissitudes of constitutional anxiety, economic security is sought perhaps more gravely against fate. He disparaged the potential for idolatry engendered by capitalism in its excessive promotion of the accumulation of things, because genuine security is to be sought in the providence of God. Pride of knowledge, or intellectual pride, is a more spiritual sublimation of the pride of power. This type of pride is derived from what he called the ignorance of the finiteness of the human mind and the attempt to obscure the known conditioned character of human knowledge and the taint of self-interest in human truth. Human beings are never truly ignorant of our ignorance. We can avoid sin by acknowledging our limitations. But who knows how to say, I don't know? Who knows how to say, I'll have to check? Who knows how to say, I'll have to research that? We are acutely aware that to possess knowledge is to possess power. This is why we are all in graduate school, I as a teacher and you as a student, because we know that possessing knowledge is to possess power. Thus, according to Niebuhr, all human knowledge bears an ideological taint by which human beings attempt to conceal our self-interests, namely the fear of censure, and a concomitant loss of power. This is demonstrably true of the dominant classes. Niebuhr stated that, quote, every ruling oligarchy in history, end quote, has maintained its authority by controlling the ideological bases of society and by sacralizing them with pretensions that they contain ultimate truth. Citing American, quote-unquote, Negro-white relations as an example, Niebuhr claimed that the pretensions of the dominant class, the white classes, were intended to save the self from the abyss of meaninglessness and self-contempt which always yawns before it. This is precisely why, white people presume the prerogative of naming themselves as the standard of everything, from beauty to intellect to morality. According to Niebuhr, without divine sanction for this ideology of domination, what we sometimes refer to as revealed knowledge, whites would suffer not only the loss of privilege they enjoy relative to blacks, they would also have to face the awful judgment of history that they are, like the French aristocracy of the 18th century, simply rotten. The pride of virtue, or moral pride, is the pretension of finite man that his highly conditioned virtue is the final righteousness, and that his very relative moral standards are absolute. Those involved in the sin of moral pride mistakenly assert that our standards are God's. We judge others by our own standards and find them evil when they do not conform. Niebuhr distinguished between simple moral theory, including various forms of Christian moralism, and biblical moral theory. Simple moral theories, whether informed by a works righteousness consciousness or by election theology which facilitates political domination, effectively deny the need for God, both as judge and savior, because they rest on human attempts at self-justification and betray the taint of self-interest in human relations at every level of our interaction with each other. Biblical moral theory, on the other hand, resists all such attempts because it accords to God alone the moral authority to judge and leaves intact the freedom of God to teach, heal, forgive, save, that is, to act as God wills. It names God only as just. The parable of the Pharisee and the publican in Luke, the 18th chapter and the 10th verse, according to Niebuhr, demonstrates the fact that God's freedom is the power of mercy beyond judgment. Niebuhr posited a secret connection between cruelty and the self-righteousness which can be seen, for example, in the theological terrorism patent in the white Dutch settlers' use of election theology to justify the political domination of black South Africans for years. Cruelty and self-righteousness can also be seen in fundamentalist Christian eschatology. When members of the minority white South African community asserted their right to the land's vast resources and to politically dominate the majority black population, they exempted themselves from the scrutiny of God as judge and consigned the black people there to the fires of political marginalization. When the fundamentalist church asserts that righteousness is achieved by conformity to presumptuous standards, they exempt themselves from the scrutiny of God as judge and consign others to the fires of hell. Again, Niebuhr cited Paul to give substantive force to his argument that the Bible regards the problem of sin, defined as pride, as paramount, and the sin of moral pride as tantamount to idolatry. For I bear them record that they have the zeal of God, but not according to knowledge, for they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. Moral pride culminates in spiritual pride, the pride of self-righteousness. Spiritual pride is sin in its quintessential form, because the self-deification implied in moral pride becomes explicit. Injustice is the byproduct of the apotheosis of nations, when unbridled human self-assertion identifies its standards and attainments as unconditioned good and claims for itself divine sanction. We saw this barely veiled idolatry in the events following 9/11, when the Bush administration named its retaliatory strike against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan Operation Infinite Justice, and was compelled to rename it Enduring Freedom after it had been pointed out that other religiously motivated groups in other contexts had used similar names and used a similar theological platform to do it with. Armed with absolute values, those classes infected with spiritual pride practice religious intolerance, subordinating other classes and excluding them from participation in any universe of meaning. This happened to black people in South Africa due to the entrenched effects of white South African election theology before the release of Madiba, Nelson Mandela, from prison in 1989, and the subsequent democratization of South Africa, the granting of one vote per eligible citizen that effectively turned the rule of the country back to black South Africans, who comprised 80% of the population. Democratization, though, and the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission are great moral examples of what should occur naturally according to the principle of self-determination that is a human right, and it jibes with the theological sensibilities of the largely Christian nation, whose Christian leaders have been some of the most vociferous advocates for the cause of justice in that context, and have impacted the whole world with their tenacity and sagacity. Yet these have not yet proven to be a guarantor of equality, since the white minority still controls most of the land, institutions, systems, and almost all of the industries that control South African resources. Black South Africans are still precluded from some meaningful participation in their own society. This is also what is happening to the Dalit people, the so called untouchables, who are below, not a part of, the Indian caste system. This is Niebuhr's example. The Dalit community is a constitutionally protected group according to the most recent revisions of the Indian constitutions, and these protections include the right to an education. Hence, a number of institutions serve the Dalit community at the government's behest. During my recent trip to India, I learned that most of the country's Christian population came from the Dalit community, and that they see Christianity not as an imperial religion, but as a liberator from the strictures of being subcaste and a grantor of what my mentor, the late Dr. James Cone, called somebodyness. We can also see the effects of Niebuhr's understanding of spiritual pride in the current Indian government's pursuit of Hindutva, its attempt to enforce Hindu values in a religiously plural context where Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims have coexisted for centuries, pursuing enlightenment, salvation, and spiritual surrender. This has meant a rollback of protections to, and an attempt to overburden and further marginalize the Dalit community, which included a tuition hike that few can afford to pay, as they are often compelled to work in menial occupations. While I was there with faculty and students from the Lutheran School of Theology and McCormick Theological Seminary, we witnessed massive student protests to Narendra Modi's reactionary administration that utilizes, like the current resident of the White House, the power of the conservative religious majority to undergird his brand of governance. To Niebuhr, Humankind's History of Domination proves that religion is not simply, as is generally supposed, an inherently virtuous human quest for God. He said it is merely a final battleground between God and man's self-esteem.